There was a house at the end of Maple Street that no one spoke about after dark. It sat isolated from the town, its once grand windows now boarded, its front porch sagging like a sigh from the weight of years and neglect. Yet, despite its dilapidation, the house seemed to breathe, its wooden beams creaking in a rhythm that echoed down the street, like a heartbeat waiting to be noticed. It was known simply as the haunted house. Not because anyone had actually seen a ghost, but because of the whispers that circulated every Halloween. Some said that if you stood outside the house at midnight on Halloween night, you would hear voices, faint, distant echoes, as if the past had not yet finished speaking. Others claimed that those who dared to step inside were never the same, as though a piece of them remained behind, trapped among the echoes. For years, it had been a place of dares and childish bravery, but no one had ventured close in recent memory. Until this year. "Come on, it's just a story," Matt said, a grin playing on his lips, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. He was tall and confident, always the one to lead their little group into trouble. His friends, Tom, Sarah, and Elena, exchanged glances, their faces pale in the dimming twilight. They stood at the gate now, its iron rusted and brittle, barely holding the weight of the vines that tangled around it. Beyond, the house loomed, its presence larger than it seemed from a distance. "Matt, maybe we should turn back," Sarah whispered. Her voice was thin, and she shivered despite the mild October air. "Afraid of a few old boards creaking?" Matt teased, but even he seemed reluctant to push open the gate. "I heard someone say they heard laughing coming from inside," Tom said quietly, his eyes fixed on the house. "Like a party, but when they got closer, it just stopped." Elena, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. "Look, we're here. We'll just go up to the porch, knock on the door, and leave. Prove it's nothing." They all stared at the house for a long moment. The wind stirred the trees around them, and for a moment, the leaves rustled like a faint murmur of voices. No one spoke as Matt finally pushed the gate open with a screech that seemed to echo down the street. They walked up the path, the weeds pulling at their feet, slowing their progress as if nature itself wanted to hold them back. The porch groaned under their weight as they stepped onto it. The front door was thick and swollen with age, its dark wood etched with deep scratches, as though someone, or something, had once tried to claw their way in. Or out. "Go ahead, Matt," Tom muttered, nodding towards the door. "Knock." Matt raised his hand, but hesitated. The air felt thick now, almost suffocating, as if the house were waiting for something. He rapped his knuckles against the door, and the sound echoed unnaturally, like a hollow drum in the silence. Nothing happened at first. Then, faintly, from deep within the house, there was a sound. At first, it seemed like wind sweeping through the halls, but then it grew clearer, a low murmur of voices. It rose and fell in an uneven cadence, like an old record skipping. It was the sound of conversation, of laughter, as if there were a party happening just beyond the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," Matt said, though he stepped back from the door, his face pale. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct. The voices began to overlap, like fragments of different conversations all happening at once. One moment, there was the clink of glasses, the next, the sound of footsteps hurrying down a distant hallway. Elena gripped Tom's arm, her fingers trembling. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight. But before they could move, the door slowly creaked open. Not wide, just enough for them to see into the shadowy hallway beyond. It was dark inside, but there was a flicker of light, like the faint glow of candles further in. The voices continued, and now there was no mistaking it, laughter, chatter, footsteps. It was as if a party were in full swing, just out of sight. "Come on," Matt whispered, though even he sounded unsure now. "Just a quick look." With that, he stepped inside. The others followed, hesitating at the threshold, but unable to resist the pull of the strange, echoing sounds. As they crossed into the house, the air seemed to change. It grew cooler, heavier, as if the very atmosphere had thickened around them. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly, the sounds of the outside world, the distant hum of the town, the rustling of leaves, vanished. All that remained were the echoes, and the feeling that they were no longer alone. Inside, the house felt wrong. Not just old or abandoned, there was something about the air, something that clung to the walls like a shadow too deep to be just darkness. The flickering light they had seen from the doorway was gone now, swallowed by the gloom, and the voices, though still present, seemed fainter, as though retreating further into the depths of the house. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, hugging herself as if trying to hold off a chill. Her voice barely rose above the murmurs, yet it felt intrusive in the heavy silence. Matt was the first to speak, though his bravado had noticeably waned. "It's just cold. These old places, no heating. We'll look around and leave." But no one moved. Tom stood frozen by the door, glancing back at it as though weighing the decision to turn and run. Elena, always calm and rational, found herself staring down the hallway ahead, where the sounds seemed to beckon. Faint laughter echoed from somewhere distant, punctuated by the clink of glass and the soft murmur of conversation, just as Tom had described. Yet there was no light ahead, no signs of life, just the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting. "Did someone live here?" Elena asked, her voice unnervingly flat, as if speaking aloud would disturb the balance of the space. "I mean, after it was abandoned." "No one's been in here for years," Matt said. "It's all just a..." He was interrupted by a sudden sound, a deep, resonating thud from somewhere above. It was followed by the soft patter of footsteps, deliberate and slow, like someone was pacing the floors directly overhead. Everyone froze, listening, hearts pounding in unison. The footsteps moved, not with the quick urgency of someone fleeing, but with the patient, methodical rhythm of someone searching. "It's probably an animal," Matt said, but his voice betrayed him, cracking just slightly at the end. "I don't think animals walk like that," Tom murmured, his face pale. "It sounds like someone's upstairs," Sarah finished, her eyes wide. Matt turned towards the stairs at the far end of the hallway. They were narrow and steep, barely visible in the dim light, but they seemed to beckon in the same way the voices did, a strange, insistent pull. He took a deep breath, as if trying to muster courage that didn't quite come. "Look, we'll check it out. Maybe there's an explanation for all this, something too." Another sound interrupted him, a sharp, high-pitched giggle that cut through the air like a knife. It came from the hallway to their left this time, much closer, like the voice of a child playing some unseen game. Then, all at once, the voices shifted. The distant party sounds faded, replaced by new, closer noises, footsteps, whispering, the scraping of chairs being moved just out of sight. The air around them felt alive with motion, like the house was stirring, waking up. "We need to leave," Sarah said suddenly, panic seeping into her voice. She turned, pulling at the door behind them, but it wouldn't budge. "Matt!" "The door's stuck." Matt rushed over, trying to help, but the door felt as though it had grown roots into the floor, unmovable, unyielding. Tom and Elena watched in silent terror as the soft sounds of the party began again, this time louder, like the echoes were drawing nearer. "This can't be happening," Elena muttered, backing away from the door, her eyes darting to the windows. They were covered with thick boards, long nailed in place, blocking any chance of escape. "We can't be stuck in here. This isn't real." "Maybe it's just jammed," Matt insisted, though his voice had lost its usual confidence. He pulled harder at the handle, but the door didn't give an inch. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, as if the house itself were leaning in, listening to their fear. "We need to go upstairs," Elena said suddenly, surprising even herself with the suggestion. "If there's someone up there, maybe they know how to get out." "No way," Tom said. His face was pale, his body rigid with fear. "We're not splitting up." "Then come with me," Elena said, already heading towards the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the hollow, expectant air. The others hesitated, torn between the unsettling feeling of staying where they were and the even more unsettling feeling of following Elena into the darkness above. But the choice was made for them as the laughter started again, closer this time, a soft giggle that seemed to drift down from the second floor, like someone was waiting for them to follow. Elena took the first step, and the stairs creaked beneath her, the sound unnervingly like a sigh. Matt followed, then Sarah, clutching his arm, and finally, Tom, the last to abandon the front door, his reluctance weighing heavier than the dark around them. As they climbed, the air seemed to grow colder, denser, the voices fading into a distant hum once again. Yet, something else lingered in the silence, a presence, just out of reach, watching, waiting. Each step felt like a descent rather than an ascent, as though the house was drawing them deeper into its secrets. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway stretched out before them. The air here was different, stale, heavy with a scent of dust and time long past. There were doors on either side, some half open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And then, from the far end of the hallway, they heard it, clearer than before, unmistakable, the sound of someone breathing. The breathing was unmistakable. Low and rhythmic, it filled the narrow hallway like an unseen tide, rising and falling in the darkness ahead. The four of them stood at the top of the stairs, frozen by the sound. It wasn't the hurried breath of panic or fear, it was calm, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was there had been waiting for them all along. Elena was the first to move. She stepped forward, her hand brushing against the peeling wallpaper as if she needed to touch something tangible in the midst of the growing dread. The floor creaked beneath her weight, and with each step, the breathing seemed to shift, growing fainter, then closer, as though it were circling them unseen. Matt hesitated, glancing back at the stairs as if calculating the chances of forcing the front door open again. But the thought of returning to the ground floor, where the whispers and laughter waited, made him stay. Sarah clung to him, her breath coming in short gasps. Tom trailed behind them, his eyes darting from door to door, as though he expected one of them to swing open at any moment. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, with doors lining both sides, some ajar, others firmly shut. Shadows clung to the corners, thick and unyielding, and though the air was cold, there was a stifling weight to it, like something unseen pressed down upon them all. The walls, though still and solid, seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. "Elena," Matt whispered, his voice barely carrying in the oppressive quiet. "We should turn back. This isn't right." But Elena pressed forward, her gaze fixed on the end of the hallway where the sound of breathing seemed strongest. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, an irresistible pull that she couldn't explain. There was something at the end of this hallway, something she needed to see, even if she couldn't name it. As they moved, the laughter from below returned, muffled now, like a distant memory seeping through the floorboards. It was accompanied by the faint clinking of glasses, the murmur of voices engaged in conversation. It was the same strange, echoing party that had greeted them when they first entered the house, but now it felt closer, as if the past was bleeding through into the present, pulling them further into its fold. Sarah's grip on Matt's arm tightened, her nails digging into his skin. "I don't want to be here anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's leave." "We can't," Matt muttered, though he wasn't sure why. It was as though the house itself had locked them in, its unseen fingers twisting around their fear, holding them in place. He could feel it, just as Elena did, that there was something they had to confront, something waiting for them ahead. Then, suddenly, Elena stopped. She stood before a door at the end of the hallway, larger than the others, its wood swollen and warped with age. The sound of breathing was louder now, just behind the door, steady and patient. She reached for the knob, her hand trembling, but before she could touch it, the door creaked open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. "Elena," Matt started, but his voice died in his throat. From the shadows beyond the door, a figure emerged, tall, indistinct, its features blurred in the gloom. It moved slowly, with the careful grace of someone who had all the time in the world. The breathing, which had once been an external sound, now seemed to come from within them, filling their ears, their minds, as if the house itself were breathing through them. The figure stopped just inside the threshold, its face still hidden in the shadows. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with an unspeakable tension, a waiting silence that seemed ready to snap at any second. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made the floorboards beneath them groan. "You've come back," it said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry, the words stuck in her throat. She didn't understand what it meant, but the way it said it, as though she had always been part of this place, part of whatever lingered here, made her stomach churn with an unnameable fear. We're leaving," Matt said, finally finding his voice. He stepped forward, his hand on Elena's arm, trying to pull her back. But the figure only tilted its head, as if amused by the suggestion. "Leave," it repeated, almost mockingly. "But you're already here." The words seemed to sink into them, heavy and final. The shadows around them deepened, and the laughter from below grew louder, almost frenzied now, as if the unseen party had reached some terrible climax. The house seemed to shift beneath their feet, the walls closing in, the air pressing tighter around them. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut, cutting off the hallway behind them, sealing them inside with the figure. Elena gasped, spinning around, but there was no longer a door. Just a solid wall where the entrance had been moments before. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, oppressive and ancient, as though it had been waiting for them for centuries. "This is where you belong," it whispered, its voice like a breeze through the graveyard. The others stood in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. There was no way out now. Whatever had drawn them here, whatever the house wanted, it had them. And it wasn't letting go. The room was suffocating, and though the walls had not physically moved, it felt as if they were being crushed under the weight of something unseen. Elena's breath quickened, and she pressed her back against the wall where the door had been, trying to steady herself, but there was no relief. The air was thick with an eerie presence, as though they were no longer alone, though only the figure stood before them. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, a reminder that the house was as alive as the thing that lingered within it. Then, from behind the figure, the sound of shuffling feet. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, accompanied by the soft hum of voices. Low, indistinct, like a gathering crowd. The four friends exchanged nervous glances. Whatever was happening, they were no longer alone in this house. The air pulsed with a strange energy, a cold that seeped into their bones, as if the house had become a vessel for all the things that once were. The figure, still standing in the doorway, took a step back, as though giving space for whatever was behind it to come forward. And out of the shadows, they emerged. They were barely visible at first, ghostly shapes moving along the edges of the room, drifting in and out of the faint light that barely illuminated the space. But as the figures drew closer, it became clear that they were not just shadows. They were people, faint, translucent, as if made from smoke and memories. Faces blurred by time, clothes from another era, their movements slow and deliberate. They did not acknowledge the group, but their presence was undeniable. One of them, a woman in a tattered gown, her hair wild and unkempt, drifted past Matt, her expression vacant, eyes glassy as though she could not see him. Another figure, a man with a crooked hat and a walking cane, shuffled closer to Tom, his lips moving in silent conversation, though no sound came out. Elena tried to move, but her legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the house itself had anchored her in place. She looked at Matt, his face pale in the dim light. What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Matt shook his head. There were no answers here, only questions. The figures, dozens of them now, continued to fill the room, mingling and murmuring as if they were attending a party. The air buzzed with the soft hum of their indistinct conversations, but the words were just beyond hearing, lost to time. They moved around the group as though they were not intruders but guests who had always belonged to this strange gathering. The figure in the doorway watched them closely, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "They are always here," it said softly, its voice like the rustling of autumn leaves. "This house holds them, as it will hold you." Tom, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "What do you mean, hold us? We're not staying here. We're leaving." His voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in his usual bravado. The figure tilted its head, almost pitying. "You misunderstand," it said gently. "You are already part of this place. The moment you crossed the threshold, you became one with it." Elena's heart pounded. She looked again at the spectral figures moving around them, and for the first time, she noticed something unsettling. Some of the figures were clearer than others. Almost solid. One of them, a young man with dark hair and an old-fashioned suit, brushed past her, and she felt the faintest touch, as though he were not entirely intangible. His face seemed familiar, too familiar. It hit her then, like a cold rush of dread. "Elena," Matt's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need to go. Now." But Elena couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the young man, whose face was a perfect reflection of her own fear. She had seen him before, not here, but in the mirror, in her own reflection. It was him. It was Matt. The spectral version of him, wandering the room as though he had been here for centuries. She gasped, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "Matt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's you." Matt frowned, confusion and fear battling for dominance in his expression. "What are you talking about?" Elena pointed to the figure, no longer a distant echo, but a perfect replica of Matt, down to the clothes he was wearing. It stood just a few feet away now, its head tilted, its eyes vacant and distant, but unmistakably him. Matt followed her gaze and his face went pale. "That's not me," he muttered, stepping back. "That's not." But the figure moved closer, its mouth opening as though it were trying to speak. It reached out, its hand extending toward Matt, but before it could touch him, another figure, this one a mirror image of Elena, appeared beside it. The realization was unbearable. They were seeing themselves, echoes of their own lives trapped within this house, reflections of what they would become if they didn't leave. Sarah screamed, breaking the tension, her voice piercing through the low hum of the house. "We have to get out of here," she cried, backing toward the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't stay." But the house was not going to let them go. The whispers grew louder, the air thicker, and the figures, the echoes of their own selves, began to surround them, closing in with a terrifying certainty. Sarah's scream shattered the eerie calm, but in the same breath, it seemed to awaken something deeper in the house. The whispers, once muffled and distant, swelled into a rising cacophony of voices, frantic, pleading, angry. The room, which had once felt large and imposing, now seemed to constrict around them, the walls drawing closer with each breath they took. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet was like a pulse, steady and relentless, as if the house itself was alive, beating with the tension of the moment. "Elena, move!" Matt's voice was sharp, but Elena remained frozen, her gaze locked on the apparition that mirrored her so perfectly. The figure was almost close enough to touch her, its hand raised as though reaching for something just out of reach. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. She felt an icy chill snake down her spine as the doppelganger's eyes, her own eyes, locked onto hers. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the figure's expression shifted, and Elena swore she saw it smile. A smile of knowing, of acceptance, as though it was simply waiting for her to step into its place. "Elena!" Matt's hand gripped her arm, pulling her roughly out of her daze. She stumbled, her knees buckling, but he caught her. "We need to go now." The urgency in his voice snapped her back to reality. She tore her gaze away from the figure and turned toward the door, but the way out was no longer clear. The spectral figures, some mere shadows, others disturbingly solid, had formed a silent, shifting wall between them and the doorway. And beyond the figures, that same eerie glow pulsed in the air, as if something was waiting, watching. I don't know if we can," Elena whispered, her throat tight with fear. Tom, pale and trembling, stood beside Sarah, who was sobbing quietly now, her back pressed against the wall. "There has to be a way out," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. His bravado, once so certain, had cracked. We just need to find it." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The house had trapped them. It had been waiting for them from the moment they crossed the threshold. This place, with its lingering shadows and voices from the past, was not just haunted, it was a cage. And they were the next occupants. The figure in the doorway, still and silent amidst the growing chaos, spoke again. Its voice was soft, barely audible above the rising din, yet each word cut through the air like a blade. "You don't leave here," it said, its tone matter of fact. "You become." The weight of those words sank deep into Elena's chest. She felt her heart race, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We can't. We're not staying." The figure didn't respond, but its eyes glinted with something dark, something inevitable. "Enough of this." Tom suddenly lunged toward the nearest figure, his hand outstretched as if to push it aside, but his fingers passed through the translucent form like mist. He stumbled back, his face contorting with panic as the figure, the echo of a long-lost guest, continued to move, unaffected by his attempt. Tom's eyes widened in horror as he turned back to the others. "They're not real," he gasped. "They're not." But before he could finish, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing what little light remained. The room plunged into near darkness, save for the faint glow that still seemed to pulse from the walls. And in that moment, the whispers became voices. Clear, distinct, and overwhelming. "They're here," one voice said. "They won't leave," another added. "They belong to us now," a third whispered, closer than the others. The voices overlapped, a chorus of those who had come before, those who had once thought they could leave but had never managed to escape. Their words echoed around the group, disorienting, as though the very air was thick with the weight of past regrets. "Elena!" Sarah's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Elena's mind raced. Every instinct screamed to flee, to find some way out of this nightmare, but every corner of the room seemed to shift and change before her eyes. The figures were everywhere now, crowding the space, their faces blurred but somehow recognizable. And then it hit her, the terrible realization that was too horrifying to fully grasp. The faces weren't just echoes of strangers. They were themselves. Not just Matt, or her own reflection from earlier, but all of them. Tom, Sarah. Each of them was mirrored in these ghostly figures, as if the house had already claimed them, their fates sealed before they had even arrived. "No," Elena breathed, her voice barely audible. But even as she denied it, she saw the version of herself, her own spectral reflection moving just out of reach, her face devoid of fear, as if resigned to its fate. She turned to Matt and saw his double too, pacing slowly in the shadows. "We have to get out of here," Elena finally said, her voice firmer now, though her legs felt heavy, her movements sluggish as if the house itself was trying to root her in place. Matt nodded, gripping her hand tightly. "We'll find a way. We have to." But the house had other plans. The figures closed in, their silent march relentless, and the walls seemed to pulse with life, drawing ever closer, ready to swallow them whole. The air had grown impossibly heavy, thick with an unnameable pressure that pressed down on them from all sides. Elena could feel it in her chest, in her bones, as if the house was not merely trapping them, it was suffocating them. She tried to breathe, but each inhale was shallow, as though the very walls were stealing her breath. The shadows around them flickered and shifted, the ghostly figures whispering, inching closer, with expressions that were no longer blank but filled with quiet, inevitable purpose. "Elena, we have to move." Matt's voice sounded distant, hollow, but his grip on her hand was tight, almost desperate. "I know," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. Every part of her was screaming to run, but run where? There was no exit, no escape. Only the endless maze of hallways, staircases that looped back on themselves, and doors that led to nowhere. The house was toying with them, letting them think they had choices, but in truth, they had none. "We'll go back the way we came," Matt insisted, his voice trembling with fear barely concealed by determination. "Back to the front door." But Elena knew what he didn't, or perhaps wouldn't, acknowledge. There was no going back. There never had been. Once they stepped beyond the gate, the house had claimed them, like it had claimed so many before. She could feel it, in the air, in the floor beneath her feet. The whispers, the figures, those were the remnants of others who had made the same mistake. They hadn't escaped, and neither would they. But still, they moved. Elena, Matt, Tom, and Sarah, clinging to some thin thread of hope, forced their feet to move despite the weight of dread that dragged at them. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, bending and warping in ways that defied logic. Doors that they had passed minutes earlier reappeared in front of them, and staircases descended into floors they hadn't remembered climbing. The whispers grew louder, clearer, forming words now. Words that echoed in Elena's mind with a chilling finality. "You can't leave," they said, over and over. "You never leave." Sarah stumbled, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I can't do this anymore," she gasped, her voice breaking. "We're not getting out of here." Elena grabbed her arm, trying to steady her, but there was nothing to say. No reassurance, no comfort. only the cold truth that had begun to settle in her heart. They weren't going to leave. Suddenly, Tom stopped in his tracks, staring ahead at something in the dim, flickering light. "Look," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. At the end of the hallway, there it was. The front door. It stood there, slightly ajar, the faint light of the outside world spilling in like a beacon of salvation. Matt's grip tightened on Elena's hand. "See? We can make it. Come on." They surged forward, stumbling and running toward the door with renewed hope. The whispers seemed to recede, fading into the background as if the house itself was losing its grip on them. The door was right there, just a few steps away, promising freedom, escape. They could almost feel the cool night air, taste the relief of being outside, away from the madness. Matt reached the door first, throwing it open with a triumphant shout. "We made it!" But as they stepped through, something was wrong. The air didn't change. The oppressive heaviness remained, and the light outside flickered strangely, like an illusion. Elena looked around, her heart sinking as the realization hit her. They hadn't escaped at all. The door they had passed through wasn't an exit, it was the entrance. They were back in the foyer, standing in the exact spot where they had first crossed into the house. "No," Elena breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "No, no, no." Matt stared at her, his face pale. "It's impossible." "How?" But the house didn't care about what was possible. The house had its own rules, and they were now a part of it. The whispers surged back, louder and more insistent than ever. The figures in the shadows seemed closer now, surrounding them, their faces clear. Elena saw her own reflection again, but this time it wasn't a mere trick of the light. It was her. A part of the house. A part of the echoes. "We never leave," the voices said, filling the room with their mournful song. Tom dropped to his knees, his face in his hands, rocking back and forth in silent despair. Sarah stood motionless, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she had already accepted her fate. Only Matt remained standing, his jaw clenched in defiance, but even he couldn't hide the terror in his eyes. Elena looked around at her friends, her companions on this ill-fated journey, and felt the crushing weight of inevitability settle over her. They were the next echoes, the next voices to haunt this place. Just like all those who had come before. The house had one. And then, as if in response to that final, silent acknowledgement, the front door swung shut with a soft, deliberate click, sealing them inside forever.